Let's start with some basic training, troops. What the hell's a NATO? All right, question 1. What the hell is it? NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it is a defensive pact between a hell ton of countries, basically to all promise to protect each other in case any of them are attacked by an outsider, by anybody outside of the group. Now, the only thing you really got to remember about NATO to understand its power and significance is Article 5 of their charter. Now, they got a big charter and a constitution with lots of pages and lots of rules and regulations. You only got to know Article 5. 5's the magic number to know. The number to know is 5. Article 5 is the meat and potatoes. It's the spine of the whole NATO organization. All right, what the hell's in Article 5? Article 5 is the piece of the charter which says, if you join this club, if you are a NATO member, all right, you promise that if any single country in NATO is attacked, any attack on one will be interpreted as an attack on all of us. And therefore, all of us will muster all of our military might to repel that attack. And therefore, go then beat the living shit out of whoever was the attacker. Oh my God. Do you see why it's so powerful now? All of the countries consider an attack on anyone as an attack on them personally, and they all gotta go fight the fight. An example, Luxembourg. They're a member of NATO. Luxembourg? What? That's right. I mean, could Luxembourg really repel an invasion by anybody? If Russia attacked Luxembourg, could Luxembourg win? If China attacked them, could Luxembourg repel the Chinese? If I personally attack Luxembourg, could they beat me? I think not. I'm a pretty resourceful guy in the field. However, Luxembourg is a NATO member. Oh, that's the game changer. Because if any entity from outside attacks tiny Luxembourg, all they got to do is invoke Article 5. And all of the countries of NATO have to come help them and therefore go beat the shit out of the Russians or the Chinese or me. And they can do that. Luxembourg doesn't even need an army, dudes. They got NATO. Nobody's ever going to mess with them. The Article 5. All right. Point 2. When did it form? And who was in this NATO? Where did it come from? NATO started up just after World War II. Not unlike many of the supranationalist organizations we've talked about, like the United Nations. And it was originally comprised of kind of the good guy winners of World War II, except the Ruskies. And by that I mean it was the United States as the core, Canada, and most Western European powers. The big players like France, the UK, Italy, but also Norway, Portugal, Iceland. So Western Europe and US, Canada. There were the kind of the original members. Question 3, why? Why did this entity form in the first place? Why did that group of countries get together and say, hey, we all promise to protect each other? This is easy. You can sum this up pretty much in a simple phrase. NATO was formed as an anti-USSR bloc. Simply put, after World War II, remember, the USSR was an ally of the good guys in World War II. It was an ally of the United States and France and the UK to fight against Nazi Germany. However, so they were friends at the time. However, right after World War II, the USSR was seen as a major threat to the Western democracies because during the course of World War II, the Ruskies, that is the Soviet Union, had expanded in their attack against Germany on that Eastern Front. They had moved into Eastern Europe and took over places like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. And they helped liberate those places from Nazi Germany. And then when the allies from the West, the US and France and the UK, met up with the Soviets in the East, everybody high-fived in the middle of Europe, and then the Soviets stayed. So it became a situation where those Eastern European powers, places like Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, then became Soviet puppets. And it was understood in the world that perhaps this was against the will of those Eastern European states. So even though they were allies during World War II, at the conclusion, immediately everybody was like, holy shit, we're kind of worried about the Soviets. The threat was that eventually, as they grew more powerful, the Soviet Union would roll over and take over the rest of Western Europe. And they could. Of course, they could have beat Luxembourg. They could have beat Italy. They could have beat any of these countries one-on-one. And that, my friends, is why the mighty United States of America came up with this plan and said, hey, let's do this. Look, the war's over. And we don't want to intentionally fan the flames of the next war with, the Soviets. But at the same time, we're worried about them. And at the same time, we also don't want to leave 1 million U.S. troops in Europe to keep protecting the Europeans from the threat of Soviet invasion. So let's do this. Let's form up this union, this NATO, and we won't have to therefore leave our troops there. And Russia will be too scared to attack because Article 5 is right out there. It's public information. We're telling you, commies, if you invade Luxembourg, we will come down on your heads with a rain of hell and fire from the sky to destroy you. And it worked. That's largely why you have the whole Cold War scenario set up for the next 50 years of European history. NATO was formed as an anti-USSR, an anti-Soviet expansion, an anti-communism expansion, and to protect the U.S.'s allies in Western Europe. Hoo-yah! All right. Question 4. How does it work? It's really a unique group because it is very democratic. It's all democratic nations. And so they kind of vote on whether to go to war or not. Now, that may seem silly because you're thinking, what? You don't have to debate about it if you've been attacked. Well, not in the old days, but in the new modern era, it's kind of a little more tricky. So, 50 years ago, had the USSR invaded Western Germany, that would have been obvious. Everybody would have known it. And Western Germany would have said, we're invoking Article 5, come help us. And therefore, you would have had World War III. That never happened, of course, by the way. But the way that this rolls in NATO is the countries get together and say, okay, has one of our members been attacked? Do we deem this an attack? Who is the culprit? Okay, let's vote. Is this going to happen? It's going to go down. Let's do it. Okay. Now, again, here's why it's so tricky in the modern era. Article 5 was never invoked. Obviously, there was no obvious invasion in the past. But when the United States was attacked September 11th, 2001, the United States went directly to NATO and said, Article 5, baby, Article 5. Let's line it up. Let's rally troops. And the NATO group had to get together and say, okay, well, obviously some shit happened, but are we considering this an attack on the United States? And Article 5 says we have to help the United States. And they actually said, yes, you're right, United States. An attack on one is considered an attack on all, and we're with you. Let's do this. But who are we going to get? And that's when they had to decide, we're going to go get Afghanistan. But more of that later. So the group gets together to decide on whether attack has occurred and then, therefore, how to counter it, what to do next. Okay? How does the command structure work then? The nuts and bolts. I do want you to know this. The United States always leads NATO in the field of battle. And actual battlefield conditions, there will be a military superstructure that looks over and organizes the whole war, and the head of that in the field is always someone from the United States of America. One of the reasons for that is the United States contributes the most troops and the most money and the most weaponry, so they have the most say. The U.S. always likes to be in charge of its troops, by the way, too. The U.S. actually does not give troops to the United Nations because they say, no. We ain't giving you guys stuff. We refuse to have anybody but a U.S. person in charge of U.S. troops. That is true in the NATO superstructure as well. So the U.S. always leads the command structure in the field, in an actual war. However, there's always a European person who is in charge of the NATO bureaucracy. And NATO headquarters are in Belgium, in Brussels, Belgium. And there's always a European who's the actual head of the kind of day-to-day operations and the running things and the management of monies and troops and all that. The bureaucracy is led by always led by European. In the field, it's always led by an American. Now, all of the NATO countries have to contribute, okay? They contribute either troops and or money and or weaponry, okay? But as I suggested, the U.S. does the most, so they are kind of the logical runner of things out there in the field. When a war is happening, like the NATO war in Afghanistan, There are German troops there and French troops there and British troops there, and they will be headed directly by a commander, all right? There'll be a British guy in charge of the British people, but at the top of that food chain in the field, always a U.S. guy. Again, this is because the U.S. gives the most and really is the true power of NATO, because the U.S. is the biggest military on the planet with the most nuclear weapons and the most aircraft carriers and the most jets. So it's kind of logical that the U.S. is in charge of these things. You can view the United States involvement in NATO as... NATO is really seen in today's world as a U.S. military extension internationally. It's kind of like the U.S. can fight a war through NATO, and it just gives it kind of international window dressing, if that makes any sense. The U.S. is always kind of in charge and always kind of the coalition leader. It's true now in Afghanistan, but it was when the U.S. was leading the charge against communism throughout all of the Cold War. Everybody kind of knew that if a fight broke out between NATO and the Soviet Union, it really was going to be the U.S. facing off against the USSR with some help from their European buddies. The U.S. was always the coalition leader taking charge of killing commies, if it ever came to it, which it didn't. But wait a minute. There is no more USSR. There are no more commies to fight in Europe. There is no threat of Soviet expansion in Europe. So what's the deal with NATO now? Why do they even exist? Should they continue to exist? Have they shrunk since the end of the Soviet Union? Let's get to that next.